All right, everybody, it's Dr. Parker. I am here to talk about your responses to the House of Fame, which, as usual, I thought were terrific. I thought you did a great job. It's a really difficult text. There's no one right way to handle it, that's for sure. And I think you all had some really good ideas. The recording today might be, I might need to cut it into smaller pieces so I can upload it a little bit better. I also may get interrupted. I'm at home with a sick child today, so I don't necessarily expect this is going to be the smoothest of the smooth, but you never know. And but anyway, so I want to start with Sarah's responses because they were the first ones I got in. And the first question about literature versus history and the authority that they each have. Chaucer's very concerned with authority, and you're going to see that time and again in his works. The line between history and literature for the medievals was a lot blurrier than it is for us. We tend to see kind of a clear, bright separation between the two. And for them, it wasn't really the same. A text like the Aeneid, for example, very much functioned for them as history, as being just as full of factual information as history was. And by the same token, histories were often invested with imagined conversations between historical figures and things that we now would not, probably strictly speaking, want to put in a history. So the question of authority is going to often depend less on genre and more on the status of the author, whether the author is a historian or a literary author. And we see this kind of, we see this kind of spoken of in the middle part of the House of Fame. And so, right, in this first response, the poem speaks of literature as a means of promoting fame. Author does not appreciate the effect literature has on fame because it functions as a sort of propaganda. I'm inclined to say history is more authoritative than literature because it's not as subjective. But then, of course, you go on to give the flip side to that, which is, in fact, that history is subjective and can be subjective. And it's, as they say, history is written by the winners. And certainly, it's even in that time, it's even more subjective, I guess I would say. If you compare historians, you can clearly tell their opinion of who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's in the right, who's in the wrong. And the works of history certainly promote an agenda. There may even be ways in which literature is more effective in that it doesn't pretend to be unbiased. And I don't think that, and the thing is that the medievals weren't so much concerned with the factual accuracy of history. They were more interested in a moral truth being told than they are a documentary type truth. We're very attached to the idea of history is what happened, and of course it's not, and it's never the whole truth, just simply because it can't be. But I think in the Middle Ages they were less concerned with that, and so for them a piece of imaginative literature could function in a really similar way to a piece of history. So. Good. Number one. Number two, I enjoy the last scene cuts off at the climactic moment. Yeah, I agree. This was the question about where's the comedy in this poem, and I think that is certainly a place where there's comedy because there's this huge buildup that we're going to learn something about love. We're going to learn an authoritative thing, and then depending on how you interpret it. Now, if you interpret this as it's only accidentally unfinished, and Chaucer actually did have something. Or you can interpret it more as, this was a deliberate joke. This is part of the poem. And I think if you bring the narrator, if you bring Chaucer's narrator into it, this poor dopey, goofy little guy who's finally going to learn something, of course he's not. There's no question about it. The next question about science fiction, I'll talk about that for a second. By science fiction, I do mean that. I mean, I don't mean just fantasy. In my working definition of things, the difference being that science fiction actually takes elements of science and scientific advances and sort of projects them forward and then thinks about the world that we might live in, resulting from those technologies or something to that effect. Um, and so they're definitely they're elements both of fantasy and science fiction. Sarah writes, "The House of Fame felt science fiction-esque in the way the narrator adventures through the sky on the back of a talking eagle." And I think it's Rebecca who pointed out the similarity to the never-ending story, which is an image I'll never be able to shake. Again, thank you. But the idea that that could be a science fiction element, but it certainly could be a fantasy element, I think. But you do mention the idea of this being a space odyssey. I think the parts of the poem that I'm thinking more of in terms of science fiction, and will some of you get a little bit more into it in your answers, is the idea, the study of acoustics, for one thing, talking about the science of sound, how the way that sound travels, and that's sort of offered as an explanation of why rumor and fame can travel so quickly. And then in the Wicker House, we have this idea of the centripetal force of the house forcing out the utterances, the broken air utterances of rumors, sending them sort of flying around the world. So there's a little bit of that going on, and some astronomy. I think that Chaucer definitely, when he has the Chaucer, the narrator's looking up at the constellations, he doesn't understand that. The eagle sort of acts as a teacher. Chaucer's always very interested in astronomy. Normally, any details that he's got in his works are correct. He even wrote a technical work called Treatise on the Astrolabe, which is a tool, is an instrument, sort of like a sextant that was used to find stars in the sky. And so he actually was a very, very avid amateur astronomer. So anytime you see references to stars and planets and things like that, they're almost always going to be accurate. In fact, we often use those to project dates. Like in the Canterbury Tales, we know the sun is halfway through the sign of Aries, so we know that it commences around April 20th, give or take, depending on the year. So Chaucer does have an interest in science, such as it is in the Middle Ages. So the last question is about the architecture, the different buildings, and they're distinct. They're distinct from each other. They're sort of, each one is unique among. I can't think of any buildings exactly like them. Sarah has said that first we've got the Temple of Venus, which is made of glass, which is got some things in common, I think, with the scene we see in the Book of the Duchess. So we have that. We have the Palace of Fame, which is resting on a rock made of ice, and I think that that one in particular, we're supposed to see the instability of it, because fame is not something to build your life on or your palace on, and it's something that can melt away. So uh, but it's random. I mean, right? You may have a name that lasts for thousands of years if you're in on the right side of the mountain. And then finally, yeah, the Wicker House, which is really the sort of where things get crazy, and it's spinning around and it's miles around. I mean, it's hard to even begin to visualize what it might look like. And I always say, I think this is very astute when you said there's sort of a progressive loss of stability as we go from structure to structure, and I think that's true. It kind of reminds me of Three Little Pigs, the House of Sticks, that can be blown down. But of course, the thing about the Wicker House is that it's the fact that there are chinks in it and holes in it that allows the rumors and the fame to kind of fly out of them. But yeah, it certainly feels unstable, like it's going to sort of break down at any moment. And I think you're right of saying at the end there is no certainty regarding knowledge of love. So the instability of the Wicker House mirrors the instability of our grasp on love and romance. Uh, so great. So we've got just one response from Julie. and she also likes the way that you talked about the structures. Yeah, it's important to remember that the House of Fame itself is built on ice because he sort of does describe it as a rock, and it's only when you get closer that you realize that it's ice. Also, I like, Julie, that you pointed out the claustrophobic feeling of some of these places. He's really good with these big crowd scenes in making things feel festive and happy and joyful, but at the same time kind of frenetic and crowded and even a little bit claustrophobic. Yeah, I'm with you. I don't think I'd want to be particularly in any of those places for any length of time. All right, so I'm sure there's a quicker way for me to get from thread to thread, but I haven't found it yet. So looking at Callie's response now. Yeah, you mentioned having a hard time. It is a hard work, and it's hard for all kinds of reasons. It's hard because it's a dream, and there's not a logical flow from moment to moment, from place to place. It's chaotic, and yes, it's highly elusive. Chaucer is really counting on a pretty advanced level of background knowledge from you here. And of course, you can enjoy it without knowing every single allusion, but you certainly get more out of it the more that you know. And it's I think he's anticipating an audience probably that he's getting, which is to say, it's a court audience. They are people who are educated. This is what they read. These are the stories that kind of filled up their literary lives. So I don't think he's necessarily being obtuse. Let's put it that way. I don't think that he's being too difficult. I think given the expectations he could have for his readers and listeners, he's probably spot on. But for us, it's a lot to take in because we've got another 500 to 1,000 years of literature on top of all that we're supposed to have absorbed. So yeah, which is more authoritative? You're right. Chaucer certainly cites both as projecting fame, but I think history has to be more authoritative because it's less subjective. But just exactly like Sarah, then you go on to say, however, history is recorded subjectively. I think it's interesting that even now we kind of are struggling with this idea that, yeah, which is more authoritative, history or literature? Well, history's history. So we think it must be true, it must be factual. But then when we stop to think about it and think about histories that have been written in the past, if you read, or even now, if you read a North Korean history of the 20th century, it would look a lot different than one that would be taught in a U.S. schoolroom. And I think too, there's this idea of authoritative about what. I could pretty confidently make the statement that there's more truth in the play Hamlet than there is in this morning's New York Times. Now, there are more facts in the New York Times by far, and Hamlet, in fact, does not have facts in it because that was not a real person. Those things didn't happen. So the facts definitely go to the New York Times. But in terms of truth does not have to be. In fact, sometimes it helps if it's not factually based. I think what is the old saying that fiction is a lie that's used to tell the truth, or literature is a lie that's used to tell the truth. So yeah, this idea about history and literature again, probably a lot blurrier for Chaucer maybe than it is for us, and maybe he's got the right end of the stick a little bit more, possibly. Yeah, struggling with the comedy. Yeah, there's not. It's not always easy, and everything is difficult because of the translation. Yeah, if you with Chaucer, I'll tell you this: if you stop with Chaucer, it says you've written. I would stop and think, is that supposed to be funny? If you pause and you think, gosh, I wonder if that's supposed to be funny. Probably it is. It probably is. He's got lots of jokes, and it's easy to sort of to skip over something and say, well, that really sounds strange, but I must just be missing something. A lot of times you're not. A lot of times he's being funny. He's being silly. But yeah, I agree with both of you. Really have said that the eagle scenes were funny. The eagle who kind of hopelessly mocks him and makes fun of him. He's not smart. He's not romantic. He's not handsome.